I'm a high school history teacher, and recently I played Assassin's Creed 3 for the first time. This is my first Assassin's Creed game, and I'm excited to—
Wait a minute. Hold up. You've never played Assassin's Creed, and you call yourself a history teacher?
Yeah, I know it's long overdue. People have been asking me to play these games for months.
And you're starting with Assassin's Creed 3? Interesting choice.
I know a lot of fans of the series were disappointed by this game, but the historical setting of the American Revolution piqued my interest.
Alright, man. Do your thing. Just make sure to keep your tomahawk sharp and fight for the right side.
Thanks, Mr. Terry, will do. In this video, I'll discuss the real historical context behind the events of Assassin's Creed 3, which takes place from 1754 to 1783 in the British colonies of North America. The main events of the game center around the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. The present day stuff is cool and the story was intriguing, but I'm here for the history, so I won't be covering that stuff in this video. Leave a comment down below if I miss anything, and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more historical breakdowns of any other games. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Before we dive into the game's story itself, let's set the stage with some historical context. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had been living here for thousands of years prior to the arrival of Europeans. The most widely accepted theory for how they got there is that during the last glacial maximum between 12 and 30,000 years ago, when sea levels were much lower, a group of humans migrated from Siberia to Alaska across Beringia, then traveling south to populate North and South America. Over the course of thousands of years, these people had built unique civilizations including the Olmec, Maya, Aztec, Inca, and others. These civilizations developed their own languages, writing systems, agricultural methods, music, and other technology. At the peak of the Aztec Empire, the capital city Tenochtitlan was one of the largest cities in the world. Of course, everything changed in the late 15th century. In 1453, the rising Ottoman Empire finally conquered Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The Muslim caliphates and empires had been in conflict with Christian Europeans for centuries, going back to the Crusades. The Byzantines were Europe's lifeline, their only trade connection to China and India, where all the good stuff was. Now that the Ottoman Empire occupied the Middle East, Europe was cut off from the Silk Road. Around this time, Portuguese sailors invented a new type of ship called the caravel. These ships could sail in any direction, regardless of the direction of the wind. This innovation, along with the compass, which originated from China, meant that Europeans could now navigate freely around the world at any time of the year. In 1488, a Portuguese sailor named Bartolomeu Dias became the first European to sail around the southern tip of Africa, finding a new path to India. This trip took nearly a full year. Imagine the shipping costs. Educated Europeans had known the Earth was round for centuries, so while Dias was making his expeditions, Christopher Columbus proposed an alternate route to India, west, straight across the ocean. In August 1492, Columbus set sail across the Atlantic, arriving at the island of Hispaniola 4 months later. It wasn't long before Europeans realized that this was actually a whole new continent, and thus the Columbian Exchange began. This was a transfer of animals, plants, people, and diseases between the Americas and Afro-Eurasia. Plants like tomatoes, potatoes, corn, and tobacco were all previously unknown to Europeans, and horses and farm animals were unknown to the Native Americans. Since the Europeans had been living with farm animals for thousands of years, they had built up some natural immunity to many illnesses like measles, smallpox, the flu, and others. But Native Americans had no such immunity, and thus the spread of European diseases resulted in the deaths of around 90% of the entire Native American population within a few decades. In 1494, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing the world in half for them to plunder. The Spanish conquered the Aztec and Inca empires, creating New Spain, while Portugal established colonies in modern-day Brazil, Africa, and India. By the end of the 16th century, the Spanish and Portuguese became extremely rich from their colonial enterprises, so the British, French, and Dutch decided that they too would exploit the New World for their benefit. The purpose of colonization was to provide wealth for the mother country via the policy of mercantilism. Some British colonists were also motivated for social reasons. A group of English Protestants called the Puritans, led by John Winthrop, established several colonies in the northeast that later became known as New England. Given the cold climate and rocky soil, these colonies relied on fishing, shipbuilding, and long-distance trade to sustain themselves. Just south of New England, the Dutch had built colonies along the Hudson River. In a series of wars in the 1660s and 70s, the British took control of the region, renaming New Amsterdam to New York. Unlike the French, who often sought cooperation and alliances with Native American tribes, the British viewed themselves as separate and superior to the indigenous population. In 1675, confusion over the exact borders with the Wampanoag tribe led to King Philip's War, in which several tribes of Native Americans banded together in an uprising to try to evict the British. The colonists were able to successfully defeat the Native Americans in King Philip's War without any help from the formal military, boosting their confidence and developing a sense of unique colonial identity separate from the homeland. Throughout the 17th and early 18th centuries, the British government allowed their colonies to operate mostly independently, further contributing to the development of this independent mindset. The House of Burgesses, established in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia, marks the first representative government in the British colonies. In 1620, colonists aboard the Mayflower signed the Mayflower Compact, in which they agreed to form a unified political body but still remain loyal to the Crown. In the colonies, the governors were typically appointed by the Crown but often shared power with a local legislative body. The exact structure differed from colony to colony, but this relative freedom shaped American colonists' view of themselves as separate from the British, paving the way for conflict in the 18th century. Throughout the Assassin's Creed games, the overarching conflict is between two international secret societies, the Templars and the Assassins. In real life, the Knights Templar were a military order formed in the 12th century during the Crusades. After the Franks captured Jerusalem in 1099, Christians throughout Europe began making pilgrimages to the Holy City, but the path to Jerusalem was fraught with peril, so the Knights Templar was formed to protect these religious pilgrims. In 1120, the King of France granted the Templars a headquarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The Templars received lots of funding from the Christian world and soon established their own banking systems across Europe. As they accumulated vast wealth, the Templars bought farms, castles, ships, and more, operating across national boundaries and with exemption from taxes. The majority of Templars served in their financial institutions, but the Templars are most well known for their role as frontline soldiers in the Crusades. When Muslim forces recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, the Templars moved their headquarters to Acre, but they continued losing ground throughout the 13th century. In the early 14th century, King Philip IV of France, who was heavily indebted to the Templars, ordered the arrest of Templars across France. During the late Middle Ages, the monarchies of Europe were often engaged in power struggles with the Pope. King Philip saw the Templars as a threat to his authority since they were an extremely wealthy international organization that had the support of the Church and weren't loyal to any specific country. The Templars in France were accused of heresy and burned at the stake. In 1312, the Knights Templar was officially dissolved by the Pope, acquiescing to the King of France. The true fate of many of the Templars is still a mystery, and they've taken on a mythical status in modern pop culture, rumored to still be hiding in the shadows, pulling the strings of governments around the world, and even hiding religious objects like the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy Grail. In Assassin's Creed's mythology, the Templars have existed for thousands of years, trying to establish a global government called the New World Order to uplift all of humanity and ensure world peace via total control of the world. Opposing the Templars is the Assassin Brotherhood, who believe that world peace is possible without a global government, that people should be left to act according to their free will. The Assassin Brotherhood is loosely based on the Hashashin, an order of Shia Ismaili Muslims who formed a state in the mountains of northern Persia in the late 11th century. The Hashashin were opposed to the Sunni Muslim caliphates in the Middle East, and throughout the 12th and 13th century they carried out killings of many Muslim leaders and occasionally some Christians too. The Ismaili state in northern Persia was eventually conquered by the Mongol armies led by Hulagu Khan in 1256, and the Order of Assassins was destroyed by 1275. The modern word assassination refers to the tactics of the Hashashin, selective killing of high-profile people in public places to intimidate their foes. The conflict between the Assassins and the Templars is a major part of the story in Assassin's Creed, but it's pure fiction, so I won't really focus on it much in this video. In the introduction to Assassin's Creed 3, the Templar Haytham Kenway attends a play at the London Royal Theatre in 1754, but we're not just here for fun. Haytham is looking for artifacts linked to an ancient civilization. He spots his target sitting in one of the box seats, so we climb up the side of the theater to get to him. Haytham stabs the poor guy in the back and takes this medallion which he believes will give the Templars access to a repository of ancient technology somewhere in North America. So Haytham boards a ship to sail across the Atlantic. The Providence is abnormally large for a merchant vessel of the time. A ship of this size with 3 decks was usually reserved for war. In the 18th century, voyages across the Atlantic often took months, which we see as the game shows the passage of time. The captain of the Providence wants to cut costs wherever possible to ensure the trip is profitable. In this case, he chooses to save money by severely limiting food rations. The crew grows understandably restless and they start planning a mutiny. In real life, travelers in the 18th century relied on salted meats, cheese, dried fruits, anything that can be preserved for the whole trip in the era before refrigeration. But the most infamous food for sailors aboard a vessel with a frugal captain was hardtack. This extremely dense cracker made of flour, water, and salt was cheap to make and had a long shelf life, so it was an easy choice for captains looking to save money. On day 33 of the voyage, we spot a ship following us. A fictional man named Lewis Mills, a member of the Assassins, wants me dead and has left a trail for others to follow. I defeat Mills and we sail into a storm to lose the other ship. In the chaos of the lightning, rain, wind, and rough waves, the ship disappears. In the 18th century, there are several cases of hurricanes in the North Atlantic sinking ships. Nowadays, we have sophisticated weather forecasting to warn us of upcoming storms, but imagine the courage required to sail into the unknown back then. It's enough to give anyone thalassophobia. Finally, on day 72 of our voyage, we arrive at the port of Boston. The city was first founded in 1630 by Puritan settlers as part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, another charter colony similar to Plymouth. Boston remained the largest city in the British colonies until Philadelphia outgrew it. As we'll see later in the game, Boston was the center of the events that led up to the American Revolution, an iconic city with lots of history. Our first task is to locate 5 men who would be sympathetic to the Templar cause, and as luck would have it, the first of these men meets us at the docks. This is Charles Lee, a real historical figure who gives us a tour around Boston. The real Charles Lee was born in 1732 to a noble family in England. After attending school, he joined the military and was sent to Ireland in 1751. In 1754, his regiment was sent to North America to serve in the French and Indian War under Major General Edward Braddock. After some time in Europe, Lee returned to North America in 1773, where he would then serve as a general under George Washington during the American Revolution. Lee was known to have a short temper and was even named Boiling Water by the Mohawk tribe. As I continue through Boston, I run into another influential figure, Benjamin Franklin. Born in January 1706 in Boston to a middle-class family, Franklin was sent to grammar school but didn't graduate, dropping out at the age of 10. Instead, he educated himself by reading essays and poems. At 17, he ran away to Philadelphia, where a few years later he began publishing the Pennsylvania Gazette. Franklin was involved in a lot of public works, like helping found one of the first volunteer firefighting organizations in America, printing paper money for several colonies, and founding the American Philosophical Society. He was the Postmaster General for the British colonies and the first president of the University of Pennsylvania. He investigated the nature of electricity, famously conducting the kite experiment, which involved flying a kite with conductive wire in a thunderstorm to gather static electricity. He dabbled in other sciences, including thermodynamics, demography, meteorology, and oceanography. By 1750, he'd become one of the wealthiest colonists in the Americas and one of the most outspoken advocates for building a democratic republic. Franklin traveled to London in 1757, where over the next few years he would defend the American cause. In Assassin's Creed 3, he's here to give us a side quest, collecting the missing pages of his almanac. In 1732, Franklin had started publishing Poor Richard's Almanac. This popular pamphlet contained everything from poems and proverbs to calendars, puzzles, and weather reports. Finding all 36 pages of the almanac lets you build a scientific display at the homestead later on, featuring several inventions connected to Franklin, like the kite experiment and a Franklin stove. Moving on, we head into the general store to purchase a flintlock pistol. Invented in the early 17th century, flintlock pistols were an effective close-range weapon, popular among soldiers and civilians alike. The use of flint striking mechanisms to ignite black powder was standard for most firearms until the invention of percussion caps and cartridges in the 19th century. After buying the pistol, we head out to meet our next contact at the Green Dragon Tavern. This was a meeting place of the Sons of Liberty, the radical patriots whose actions contributed to the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. Walking through the tavern, you can imagine the kinds of conversations that were held here. Talk of disobedience, sabotage, and rebellion. The real-life Green Dragon Tavern was demolished back in 1832, but a new version was rebuilt in 1993, which you can visit today. At the Green Dragon, we meet our next contact, Sir William Johnson, who has leads on the location of ancient relics. In real life, Johnson was born in 1715 in Ireland and immigrated to the American colonies in the 1740s to help manage his uncle's estate in the Mohawk Valley. While there, he started his own business, trading with the Iroquois Confederation, which was an alliance of 6 indigenous nations, including the Mohawk, Oneida, Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, and Tuscarora. Johnson was well liked by the Iroquois, even earning the name Warahiigi, meaning he who does great things. For now, Johnson tells us to find Thomas Hickey, another contact who has more information on the locations of ancient artifacts. The real Thomas Hickey was a soldier in the British Army, born in Ireland but sent to the colonies during the French and Indian War. Johnson wants to build trust with the local indigenous population so that they can help us track down the locations of other artifacts. Hickey suggests that we help free a group of enslaved natives so that they'll be indebted to us. To do that, we'll need to find the next Templar contact on our list, Benjamin Church. The real Benjamin Church was born in the colony of Rhode Island in 1734. He was sent to the Boston Latin School and then got accepted to Harvard, later developing a reputation as a skilled doctor and a surgeon. Shortly before the American Revolution, he treated future US President John Adams' eye infection. For now, in the game we find him being mercilessly beaten in a seaside warehouse. We save him just before he's killed, and he joins us back at the Green Dragon to plan an attack on the fort where the fictional slaver Silas Thatcher is stationed. In the meantime, I plan to find our last Templar contact, Jonathan Pitcairn. Pitcairn was born in Scotland in 1722 and joined the military at the age of 23. He would later serve in the British Army in both the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War. In the game, we find him at a fort, being chastised by General Edward Braddock. Braddock refuses to let us borrow Pitcairn at first, but after some gentle persuasion, he finally relents, and we head back to the Green Dragon. Our plan is to sneak into the fort where Thatcher is receiving his shipment of native slaves, then free the slaves and kill Thatcher. The enslavement of Native Americans goes back to even before their first interactions with Europeans. Like nearly all societies in history, indigenous people enslaved each other as war captives when conflicts broke out between different groups. The Spanish were the first Europeans to exploit indigenous population for large-scale slave labor. They established the encomienda system to reward conquerors by granting them land and the right to own slaves. When the British, French, and Dutch arrived in North America in the early 17th century, they took advantage of conflicts between native groups to take slaves. In the 1630s, the Pequot War saw the British ally with the Narragansett and Mohegans against the Pequot tribe, resulting in the massacre and enslavement of the Pequot people. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, colonists formed short-term alliances with indigenous tribes to trade or make land deals, which sometimes led to conflict with other tribes. Knowing this history, it makes sense why this woman from the Mohawk tribe runs away when Haytham offers her a deal in exchange for her freedom. After we kill Thatcher, she comes back to help free the rest of her people, but then she disappears again. Weeks pass while Haytham waits for more leads, and now it's early 1755. I meet Charles Lee in the Green Dragon, and he tells me that the mystery woman is stirring up trouble near the town of Lexington, so I head out to investigate. I find the woman in the forest outside of Lexington, and she introduces herself as Kanya Tsio, or Tsio for short. When Haytham shows her the amulet, she tells him that she's seen markings like this before, but she wants his help before she'll tell him where they are. General Braddock is in command of troops that are killing members of Tsio's people. Haytham suggests that they kill Braddock, so we head into the town of Concord to try to find him. At a local pub, I overhear soldiers talking about how the French plan to move in on their position, so Braddock has gone south to make preparations at a forward camp. We've heard several people allude to it, and I've mentioned it a few times, so now is a good time to talk about the first major conflict of the game, the French and Indian War, also known as the North American theater of the 7 Years' War. First, some context. From 1740 to 1748, the War of the Austrian Succession broke out as several European kingdoms sought to challenge the rule of the Habsburg dynasty in Austria after the death of Emperor Charles VI. The war led to a stalemate after hundreds of thousands of deaths. Most of the warring nations were left unsatisfied with this ending, with Austria being especially annoyed that Prussia's conquest of Silesia was recognized. Tensions were brewing again in Europe, and when the Austrian-British relationship deteriorated after the war, this led to changes in European alliances known as the Diplomatic Revolution of 1756. Despite this shift in the balance of power in Europe, Britain and France remained enemies, as they had been for centuries. In North America, tensions between British and French colonists would soon lead to another war. The lands west of the Appalachian Mountains were mostly populated by Native Americans, with the exception of French settlements along the St. Lawrence River and a few smaller British settlements. The British colonial population was rapidly growing, doubling every 25 years, and soon their eyes turned to the fertile Ohio River Valley. The Iroquois Confederation controlled this area, and they were engaged in trade with both the British and the French. In 1747, the French had sent an expedition of several hundred soldiers with demands for the Native Americans to stop trading with the British. The Iroquois, fearing French aggression, sent messages to William Johnson asking for British help. In October 1753, a young major in the British Army named George Washington was sent to Fort Le Boeuf to demand that the French withdraw, a request that was again denied. A few months later, Washington led a group of Native Americans in an ambush on a French scouting party, resulting in the death of the French commanding officer there. This attack led to the official outbreak of the French and Indian War. Washington fell back to Fort Necessity, and when it was attacked by French-Canadian forces in July 1754, Washington surrendered and negotiated a retreat. News traveled slowly in these days, and only a couple months later did the British government learn of these two battles. General Edward Braddock was chosen to lead an army expedition against the French. This explains why in the game we see a large presence of British soldiers in Boston under the command of Braddock. Back in the game, Haytham and Tsio meet near Fort Necessity. I sneak into the fort to eavesdrop on a conversation between George Washington and a soldier. Washington doesn't think an attack on the French is wise, but he has his orders. They'll soon be marching on Fort Duquesne. I steal a tactical map containing the plans for the Braddock expedition and escape the fort. Returning to Tsio, we make a plan to ambush Braddock's troops as they march toward Fort Duquesne. 5 months later, it's time to execute the plan. Haytham rallies his team and we head into the forest. Tsio leads us to a meeting with representatives from 3 local tribes, the Abenaki, the Lenape, and the Shawnee. In real life, these tribes were initially allied with the French, but the Shawnee and Lenape later switched their allegiance to the British. The French were outnumbered by the British 20-1, so building alliances with Native Americans was a priority. Fortunately for the French, over the past 100 years, their colonial project had been more welcoming and accepting of indigenous peoples. Intermarriage was even encouraged, leading to the rise of the Métis people. If a Native American in New France converted to Catholicism, they were considered a natural Frenchman. There was cultural syncretism in New France, with Europeans adopting indigenous culture and vice versa. Although the British had built some alliances with indigenous peoples, especially the Iroquois Confederacy, the French were much more effective at recruiting Native Americans, giving them plenty of men to call upon when war broke out against the British. Back to the game, we see General Braddock riding through the forest along with his aide, George Washington. Braddock explains that the British colonial population is growing faster than the land can support. They need to expand into these untamed lands, never mind the fact that Native Americans already live here.
The French understand this and endeavor to prevent such growth. They skirt around our territory, erecting forts and forging alliances, awaiting the day they might strangle us with the noose they've built. This must not come to pass. We must sever the cord and send them back. This is why we ride, to offer them one last chance. The French will leave, or they will die.
So I steal a redcoat uniform and ride to Braddock's position. Right as I get into position, the French attack and Braddock runs away, so I chase him down and finish him. With Braddock dead, I meet back up with Zio so she can show the way to the ancient relics. We don't find what Haytham is looking for, but the two share a tender kiss as the screen fades to black. A few days later, Haytham meets his team back at the Green Dragon and they formally induct Charles Lee into the Templar Order. In real life, the Braddock expedition was a huge failure. General Braddock had gathered over 2,000 men, including British regulars and colonial troops, for an assault through the Ohio Valley. Braddock hoped to capture Fort Duquesne so he could control the spot where the Ohio River splits into the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. Braddock crossed the Monongahela on July 9, 1755, accompanied by Colonel George Washington as his aide. They got to work clearing a road through the dense forests of Fort Duquesne, but they ran into a combined group of French and Native American forces. At the Battle of the Monongahela, Braddock was shot, leaving Washington to organize the retreat. General Braddock succumbed to his wounds a few days later, and Washington chose a location for his burial, along what's now called Braddock's Road. When news of Braddock's defeat reached the British government, they started making more serious war plans. On May 17, 1756, the British formally declared war on the French, which led to the conflict spilling over into Europe. For the next 7 years, Britain, Prussia, and Portugal fought a massive war against Austria, France, Russia, and Spain. One of the biggest motivations for the war was competing colonial interests. All the European empires sought to expand their territory or settle old scores. The Austrians, for example, weren't involved in North America or India, but they saw an opportunity to take back territory from Prussia, so they allied with the French. The French and Indian War was just a part of the larger war, but for the sake of this video, I'll just focus on the North American theater. At first, the French had the upper hand, seizing Fort Bull and Fort Oswego in modern-day New York. The French continued raiding and harassing the British throughout 1757, but the tide soon started to shift. The British blockaded the French coast, cutting off the colony's supply lines, and defeated the French Navy in the battles of Lagos and Quiberon Bay in 1759. To make matters worse for the French, in that same year, the British launched an invasion of Quebec along the St. Lawrence River. Thousands of soldiers on both sides faced off at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, where the British captured Montreal, sealing the fate of New France. Fighting continued for a few years after the battle, but this was the decisive moment of the French and Indian War. In February 1763, all the warring countries of the 7 Years' War signed treaties to end the fighting. France gave up most of their American empire to Britain, and their claims west of the Mississippi River were transferred to Spain. Up until the 1760s, the British colonies in North America had enjoyed relative freedom to do what they wanted. Under an unofficial policy called salutary neglect, the British government turned a blind eye to colonial violations of the empire's trade restrictions. The colonists had enjoyed the protection of the British Army, and they would soon need it again. Racial tensions between the colonists and the indigenous peoples were growing, and only a couple months after the 1763 Treaty of Paris ended the French and Indian War, a confederation of Native Americans in the Great Lakes region united to drive the British out of the area. Pontiac's War lasted for 3 years and resulted in the deaths of hundreds of soldiers and civilians. King George III had had enough, and in October he issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, ordering the colonists to stop settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. But it was too late. The colonists had been moving out there for years by this point, and no fancy paper from thousands of miles away was going to stop them. Fighting the 7 Years' War across multiple continents came at a great cost to the British. The national debt nearly doubled, and they needed to find some way to pay it off, so they turned to taxation. In 1764, the British Parliament passed the Sugar Act, the first of a series of laws aimed at raising money from the colonies for the Crown. Earlier taxes had been passed, but weren't really enforced. Now the British were serious about getting their money. The Currency Act banned the colonists from making their own currency, the Quartering Act required colonists to provide housing and food to British troops, and the Stamp Act required colonists to pay a tax on all printed items, even something as small as a deck of playing cards. In response to these restrictions, the colonists protested, boycotting British goods and demanding representation in Parliament. In 1766, Benjamin Franklin, who was living in London at the time, gave a testimony to Parliament in which he argued that the Stamp Act of 1765 was unjustified because the colonists didn't have any representation in Parliament. When Franklin was asked, how then could the Assembly of Pennsylvania assert that laying a tax on them by the Stamp Act was an infringement of their rights, he responded, "They understand it thus. They are entitled to all the privileges and liberties of Englishmen, that one of the privileges of English subjects is that they are not to be taxed but by their common consent." The slogan "No taxation without representation" became a rallying cry for the Sons of Liberty, an underground political organization founded by Samuel Adams. The Sons of Liberty organized protests, boycotts, sabotage, and even violence against tax collectors in some cases. Tarring and feathering was a humiliating form of public torture where a person would be stripped down, have tar poured on them, sometimes hot, then be covered in feathers. In response to this increasingly hostile situation, the Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but they weren't ready to totally give in to the colonists' demands. On the same day that the Stamp Act was repealed, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, saying that the British government could still make laws applying to the colonies in all cases whatsoever. In 1767, the Townshend Acts were passed, creating taxes on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. The governments of the colonies started calling for unified resistance against taxation without representation, so in 1770 the British started sending troops to maintain order. Back to the game, Haetham and Zio had a son named Raton Haketon, or Connor for short. Haetham abandoned Zio and Connor to focus on his Templar mission, leaving Zio to raise the boy in their village. Playing as young Connor, I run off into the woods to play hide and seek with my friends, but soon I run into William Johnson, Thomas Hickey, Benjamin Church, and Charles Lee. They interrogate me about the location of the village, but I refuse and they knock me out. When I come to, I rush back to the village and find it burning. I try to save my mother, but it's too late. She perishes in our burning hut. In real life, the Kanien'kehá:ka people, better known as the Mohawks, lived along the Mohawk River in modern-day New York, west of the Hudson River. They spoke an Iroquoian language, and their society was divided into clans, each headed by a female elder like we see in the game. History and tradition were passed down by the women in each clan, hence Connor's deep connection to his mother and clan matriarch. The Mohawk were the easternmost nation in the Iroquois Confederacy, considered the keepers of the eastern door. In the early 17th century, the Mohawk first encountered the French along the St. Lawrence River and the Dutch near the Hudson River. The French and Dutch were mostly interested in the beaver fur trade, but soon got themselves involved in a conflict between the Mohawk and the Huron, leading to the Beaver Wars throughout the 17th century. This meant that when the French and Indian War broke out in the 1750s, the Mohawk, like the other nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, sided with the British. In Assassin's Creed 3, Connor's clan sits on sacred ground, containing the ancient relics that Haetham and the Templars are looking for. Connor has a vision that the Templars want to take control of his land, and he decides to stop them by any means necessary. In his vision, he sees the symbol of the Assassins, so Connor bids farewell to his village to seek his destiny. At the top of this hill, I find an estate occupied by a fictional old man named Achilles. At first he wants nothing to do with me, but eventually he tells me the lore of the Assassins and the Templars and trains me to become an assassin. On the wall of his basement are paintings of Haetham's team of Templars. They all must die. Achilles and Connor spend months training, then they go to Boston to pick up materials to repair the estate. Now the year is 1770. 15 years have passed since Haetham and Zio killed General Braddock during the French and Indian War. The controversy over taxation without representation has led to growing tensions between the colonists and the Crown, and now soldiers are arriving in Boston. The stage is set for the events leading up to the American Revolution, and Connor will play an important role in it all. As I walk through the city, I hear locals preaching about the injustices of the British taxes.
The Revenue Act, the Indemnity Act, the Commissioners of Customs Act. Oh, Chancellor Townshend must have thought himself so clever when he papered these thefts and made them law. That there will be no taxation without representation. Tell me, who represented us in Parliament? Who spoke on our behalf? Signed in our stead? Give me a name. Only you can't. And you know why? You can't tell me who represented us because nobody did.
When I leave the shop, I notice that the crowds are getting rowdier and rowdier. I even spot some soldiers getting into fights with the locals. A British officer named Thomas Preston orders the civilians to return to their homes. Next to Preston stands Haetham. Something shady is going on, so I follow Haetham's accomplice onto the rooftop. I take down the mercenary, but it's too late. Charles Lee fires his pistol into the air. This confuses the British soldiers, one of whom yells,
Damn you! Fire!
The soldiers opened fire into the crowd, killing several people. In real life, this event is known as the Boston Massacre. On March 5, 1770, a young British soldier, Private Hugh White, was stationed outside the Custom House on King Street. In the past few days, rumors had spread that soldiers had attacked a local man and that they were soon planning to cut down the Liberty Tree. This famous elm tree, which you can see in the game, was a meeting spot for revolutionary groups that became a symbol of resistance against the British. On that fateful night, an angry mob of colonists approached Private White and started harassing him, hoping to instigate a fight. Captain Thomas Preston, who we just saw in the game, brought 7 more soldiers armed with bayonet-fixed rifles to rescue Private White. The colonists began throwing snowballs at the soldiers, snowballs turned to rocks. Then the soldiers, believing that they had heard the order to fire, shot their weapons into the crowd, killing 5 Bostonians. Captain Preston ordered the soldiers to retreat, but they were again surrounded by an angry mob. Governor Thomas Hutchinson ordered the arrest of Preston and his soldiers, and a trial would take place a few months later. In the meantime, the Sons of Liberty took the opportunity to use this tragedy as a propaganda tool. Future US President John Adams represented Captain Preston and the soldiers during their trials. Adams was able to prove that nobody knew who, if anyone, gave the order to fire into the crowd, and Preston was acquitted. He and his men were spared, but the consequences of the Boston Massacre were much more far-reaching than he could have imagined. Back in the game, I meet up with Samuel Adams, who, being somewhat of a troublemaker, teaches me how to decrease my wanted level. In real life, there was a crypt dug under the Old North Church in Boston, housing over 1,100 bodies with brick walls lining the passageway, but this crypt didn't connect to any other parts of the city like it does in the game. Back at the homestead, Achilles gives me some assassin's blades, but we're interrupted by this guy, whose friend fell in the freezing river nearby. After I free him, we learn that they're in the timber industry, and since we need supplies to help repair the homestead, we offer them the opportunity to stay with us. Throughout the game, you can complete various homestead missions in the frontier, recruiting new people to settle back at the homestead. Completing all the homestead missions brings lumberers, farmers, a woodworker, huntress, miner, blacksmith, innkeeper, and doctor. In real life, colonial settlers had an extremely difficult time establishing homesteads and towns. Even Jamestown, Britain's first success, nearly failed in the winter of 1609 to 1610. Settlers had to deal with harsh climates, crop failures, lack of supplies, attacks from wild animals, and harassment from local tribes. You needed lots of people with different skills if you wanted your settlement to have even a chance at survival. In one mission, I save a woman who's being attacked by a bear, and in another, I help a huntress trap and kill a mountain lion. Settling westward was a seriously dangerous prospect, so it's cool that you can get a taste of daily life at the homestead. Before we get back to the main story of the game, let's take a step back to think about the conflict between the colonists and the British government so far. We've seen that the British are enforcing rules on the colonists, like higher taxes and quartering soldiers in people's homes. You might think that these actions were tyrannical and unjust, but let's think about it from the British perspective. You have these colonies that, until now, have enjoyed relative freedom to rule themselves. You've protected them time and time again from Native Americans and other Europeans, and you just finished fighting an extremely expensive war on their behalf to protect them yet again. Now you ask that they help pay you back and they start rebelling against you? You'd be forgiven for thinking that these colonists are pretty ungrateful. In the game, back in the present day, when I speak to Sean Hastings, he has this to say.
Well, for all the talk of this being a revolutionary war, it was a civil one. Well, not that kind of civil. I mean, there was no America versus Britain. It was Brit on Brit action.
He's right in saying this. The American colonists didn't see themselves as totally separate from the British. They still viewed themselves as British with all the rights of Englishmen. Even during the war, there were loyalists and patriots among the colonists. Some people thought that the revolution was too radical a solution. They still wanted to be British subjects, while others were ready for total self-governance. In the end, the people who benefited most from the American Revolution were the wealthiest colonists.
And you can clearly see how the whole thing got started. One war gave birth to the other.
You mean the 7 Years' War?
Exactly. Seems the Crown overspent in its attempt to keep the French out, wound up with a great deal of debt. Believing that the colonists should help to shoulder the burden, new taxes were created. It was a reasonable request, even if Parliament was rather, well, undiplomatic about it.
Well, it's not really fair to tax people for a war they didn't want any part of.
What? Didn't want any part of? Did you not notice George Washington with Edward Braddock? He was right there in the middle of it.
Hastings makes an interesting argument here, but even he acknowledges that the British were being undiplomatic. It makes me wonder, if the British had simply given the colonies representation in Parliament, could the revolution have been avoided? Were the colonists being unreasonable, or were the British truly at fault? Let me know what you think in the comments. Back in the game, Achilles gives me command of a ship and we get into a fight with some British vessels, giving me a chance to practice naval combat. When I return to the homestead, I'm officially inducted into the Assassin Brotherhood. I'm greeted at the front door by an old childhood friend from the village who warns that William Johnson is trying to negotiate a deal to buy the land that our village sits on. We won't let him get away with it. The year is now 1773, and I return to Boston to meet up with Samuel Adams so he can help me find William Johnson. As I follow him through Boston, we have an interesting conversation. Adams is happy that we're taking a stand against injustice, but Connor points out the hypocrisy that Adams won't publicly oppose slavery. Adams agrees that slavery is unjust, but says that the cause of the revolution must be prioritized over everything else. The issue of slavery can be resolved later. Adams points out the injustice of quartering soldiers in people's homes. This was such a problem that the Third Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, passed in 1791, forbids the housing of troops in civilian homes. As much as Adams may have believed that slavery was wrong, the reality was that each of the colonies had different priorities. The southern colonies were economically dependent on slavery, while the economies of the northern and middle colonies were more diverse and therefore more willing to end the slave trade. Further down the road, we see a man yelling out of his window at some soldiers who've come to collect a tax. He refuses to pay them, and when a fight breaks out, I help him kill the 5 soldiers. Heading back to the Green Dragon Tavern, I meet up with Samuel Adams and William Molyneux, a merchant who was also a member of the Sons of Liberty. In real life, Molyneux was a leader of the Boston Tea Party, which we'll see shortly, but first, some historical context. After the Boston Massacre in 1770, committees of correspondence were convened to coordinate colonial responses to British policy. Remember that the Townshend Acts had raised taxes on all types of products a few years earlier. In March 1770, they were partially repealed, but the tax on tea still remained. In 1773, Parliament passed a new Tea Act, which gave the British East India Company the right to sell tea in the colonies tax-free. This effectively gave the East India Company a monopoly on the tea trade, which outraged the colonists further. On the evening of December 16, 1773, a group of over 100 men, some of whom had dressed up as Native Americans, boarded 3 ships docked at Griffin's Wharf and threw over 300 chests full of tea into the ocean. Meeting Adams and Molyneux at the Old South Meeting House, we head out for Griffin's Wharf. I take out some guards, although in real life nobody died during the protests. Once we start throwing the tea into the harbor, a crowd gathers to support us. I protect the Sons of Liberty as they throw the tea overboard, and once all the tea is gone, I spot William Johnson and Charles Lee watching us. Destroying the shipment of tea has cost Johnson his income, and Connor lets him leave. In response to the Boston Tea Party, in the spring of 1774, the British government passed the Coercive Acts, better known in the US as the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed the port of Boston to all trade, put the colony of Massachusetts under direct control of the Crown, and required soldiers to be quartered in civilians' homes. This escalation would soon lead to the outbreak of war, but we'll get back to that soon. 6 months after the Boston Tea Party, in the early summer of 1774, Connor's old friend pays us a visit again at the estate. Turns out that sparing Johnson was the wrong decision, because now he's returned with enough money to buy our village's land. He's meeting with the elders of the Iroquois Confederacy to make the deal as we speak, so I rush to the clifftop where the meeting is taking place. There we see a heated discussion between Johnson and one of the Iroquois leaders.
If you wish to protect us, then give us arms, muskets and horses that we might defend ourselves.
War is not the answer.
We remember, Stanwix. We remember you moved the borders. Even today your men dig up the land, showing no regard for those who live upon it. Your words are honeyed but false.
In 1768, Johnson had negotiated the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, which greatly extended colonial borders despite the limitations imposed by the Royal Proclamation of 1763. When Johnson's men point rifles at the native leaders, that's the last straw, and I rush into the crowd to kill him. In his dying breath, he tells Connor that once the colonists have run out of room to expand and their fight with the British is done, they'll betray the Iroquois, but Connor doesn't believe him. In real life, William Johnson did actually die during a meeting with Native Americans in July 1774, but his death was supposedly due to a stroke, not at the hands of a warrior. The real William Johnson is remembered for his skilled negotiation and mostly peaceful relations with the Native Americans. I run to the clifftop and dive into the river to escape. Mission accomplished. A while later, we learn that Connor found a letter on Johnson's body addressed to John Pitcairn, telling him to sabotage the Patriots' supplies. We have our next target. But first, we get a letter from Paul Revere asking for help, so I head back to Boston in the spring of 1775. In September 1774, reacting to the passage of the Intolerable Acts, all of the colonies except for Georgia sent representatives to meet at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Here they signed the Articles of Association, calling for a complete boycott of all trade with Britain if the Intolerable Acts were not repealed. They sent a petition to King George, hoping to persuade him and de-escalate the situation, but the British government responded by declaring the colony of Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion. The colonists have been forming their own militia for decades, even deploying them during the French and Indian War. Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts and the commander-in-chief of the British forces there, received orders to disarm the militia and gather their weapons. Gage's troops began asking about the whereabouts of Samuel Adams and John Hancock, another prominent patriot and member of the Sons of Liberty. Adams and Hancock were hiding in Lexington, and a major store of weapons was located in nearby Concord, so British troops began moving toward the two towns. The colonial militia were told by the Sons of Liberty to be ready at a minute's notice, thus they earned the nickname Minutemen. On the evening of April 18, 1775, Paul Revere set out on his famous midnight ride from Boston towards Lexington and Concord to warn the Minutemen that the British were coming. In the game, we meet Revere in Boston, and he tells us about the British plan to march through Lexington to Concord. He introduces us to two other important people, William Dawes and Robert Newman. Dawes rode alongside Revere on that night to ensure that the message would reach the intended recipients. Newman, a sexton at the Old North Church in Boston, was responsible for signaling the Minutemen using lanterns in the bell tower, one if the British were approaching by land, two if they were approaching via the Charles River. On that evening, Newman lit 2 lanterns to signal the Minutemen. Paul Revere and William Dawes rode on horseback from Boston to Lexington, where they met Adams and Hancock. The Lexington militia dispatched other riders to the surrounding area, but Revere and Dawes continued on to Concord along with Samuel Prescott. The 3 men were stopped by a British patrol, and Revere was captured and questioned. Dawes and Prescott managed to escape, but Prescott was the only one who actually made it to Concord. Back to the game, Paul tells Connor that John Pitcairn is leading the British in their march on Lexington and Concord, which was true in real life. This will be our chance to take him out. So Paul and I hop on a horse and ride out to Lexington, dodging British patrols along the way as we warn the Minutemen. We run into a barely clothed woman and find Sam Prescott. In real life, Preston happened to be in Lexington that night because he was visiting a lady friend, so it's pretty funny that they included that in the game. When we finally reach the house where Adams and Hancock are staying, Paul and William decide to continue on to Concord while I stay in Lexington and wait for the British. Things are about to get crazy. The next morning, I meet up with John Parker, the man who was in command of the militia at Lexington while also battling tuberculosis. Parker was a veteran of the French and Indian War, so he gives the men some good advice. Wait until the redcoats are close enough that you can guarantee a hit. Reloading rifles back in those days took at least 30 seconds, so you had to make sure you'd hit your target or else you'd be vulnerable. Historians debate on what exactly happened here, but in the chaos of the standoff, somebody shot first. The shot heard round the world, as this was later called, marks the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Parker sends me to Concord with a letter addressed to Colonel James Barrett, the man in command of the better armed militia force there. I jump on a horse and ride to Concord as fighting rages around me. In real life, Lexington was much more of a skirmish than a real battle. After the initial shots were fired, the British soldiers fired into the militia, killing 8 men before moving on to Concord, where the real battle would take place. When I meet James Barrett, he gives me the task of commanding the defense of Concord near this bridge. In real life, the Old North Bridge in Concord was the site of the decisive moment of the battle. Colonel Barrett had wisely positioned his forces on a hill overlooking the bridge north of Concord, waiting patiently for the right moment. When he gave the order to attack, militia forces descended the hill, pushing the British across the bridge, and the two sides fired volleys at each other. In the game, instead of chasing the British across the bridge, we hold the other side as they try to advance across it. I move between the soldiers, ordering them to fire at the right moment. When enough of the British have fallen, they turn and run away. The real Battle of Lexington and Concord was a victory for the American militia, with the British retreating all the way back to Boston. Along the way, they were harassed by the Minutemen, who pulled off guerrilla attacks on the retreating soldiers. In the weeks after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the colonies sent delegates to Philadelphia once again to form the Second Continental Congress. This would be the governing body of the colonies for the duration of the Revolutionary War. In May 1775, some of the more moderate members of the Congress drafted what's known as the Olive Branch Petition. This document basically said that they still wanted to be loyal to King George and that he has the power to end the conflict. Remember that not everyone was on board with independence just yet, but a few months later, King George replied by declaring all 13 colonies to be in a state of rebellion, further escalating the conflict. In the meantime, back in the game, it's June 16, 1775, and we're at a meeting of the Congress. George Washington has been nominated as the commander-in-chief of the colonial forces, a task which he famously didn't see himself fit for. The dialogue in the game is pulled straight from his address to Congress on that day. Sitting behind us, Charles Lee chimes in that he doesn't think Washington is the best choice for the job either. Recognizing his voice, Connor stands up to confront Lee, but Sam Adams pulls him away and introduces him to Washington. Adams tells Connor that John Pitcairn is in Boston, and he sends us with a message to Israel Putnam, one of the American commanding officers stationed near Boston. The next day, June 17th, I arrive at Breed's Hill overlooking Boston. As I walk up to General Putnam, I overhear him complaining that they should have spent time reinforcing Bunker Hill instead of Breed's Hill, because the latter is in firing range of the British artillery, and this poor guy accentuates the point. Regardless, this battle will be known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, because holding that hill was the primary objective of both sides. Putnam says that as long as the British Navy can fire on their position, Pitcairn will sit tight in Boston, so I run down through Boston all the way to the ships and sabotage them. I raised the new American flag, signaling to Putnam that my crazy mission succeeded. In real life, this version of the American flag wasn't used until 1777. The variant used at the Battle of Bunker Hill would have looked like this. I rush back to Putnam and he's giving a speech to his men.
We have discipline. We have order. And most importantly, we have passion. We believe. You maintain vigilance. Conserve your ammo. Ensure a proper line of sight. And above all else, men, do not fire until you see the whites of their eyes.
Putnam tells Connor that Pitcairn is stationed on top of Moulton's Hill, just like he was in real life, so we head out to find him. I rush across the battlefield, taking cover behind trees and fallen logs, only moving out into the open when the British reload their rifles. I climb the cliff and ambush Pitcairn, delivering a fatal blow. In his dying words, Pitcairn expresses frustration that he couldn't stop the war from escalating. He warns that the idealism of the revolutionaries will just lead to more bloodshed and chaos, but Connor responds that it's better to believe in something than nothing at all. In real life, the Battle of Bunker Hill was a tactical victory for the British. The Americans ran out of ammo and were outnumbered and overwhelmed, but not before killing or wounding over 1,000 British soldiers. John Pitcairn was killed in the final volleys fired from the Americans. His son Thomas was there, and he carried his father's body to the Old North Church in Boston where he was laid to rest. The Battle of Bunker Hill served as a harsh reality check for the British. Any victory would have a heavy price to pay. Although the Americans technically lost the battle, it showed that if they could just hold out long enough, the British might lose the will to fight and they could earn their independence, but there was a lot of hard work to do first. Back at Achilles' estate, I meet a man named Benjamin Talmadge. In real life, Talmadge was an officer in the American Continental Army during the war and a skilled spy. He was the leader of the Culper Ring, a group of spies that helped expose traitors among the Patriots in the Revolutionary War. Connor tells Talmadge that according to a letter he found on Pitcairn, there's a plot to murder George Washington. Talmadge points us to Thomas Hickey and we head out to New York. Founded in 1624 by the Dutch and originally named New Amsterdam, New York is one of the oldest continuously occupied cities in North America. The Dutch were mainly focused on the lucrative fur trade in the region, and in 1626 they purchased the island of Manhattan from the Lenape tribe. The city was renamed New York when the British gained control after the Anglo-Dutch Wars. Under British rule, the city grew to become a massive trade port, especially as a center for the slave trade. Unlike the Puritan origins of Boston, New York's diverse history led to relative tolerance for different religions and ethnic groups. This idea of freedom of worship that we see in the First Amendment to the US Constitution was inspired by the culture of the colonies like New York, who had more diverse populations. We're here in New York to look for Thomas Hickey, who has been running a counterfeit money operation in the city. I find Hickey and chase him through the city, but we're both arrested on counterfeiting charges. I try to escape, but I'm stopped by Charles Lee, who explains that Washington is unfit for leadership. In reality, Washington was truly not an extraordinary tactician. Many of the engagements he participated in were defeats for the Americans, but Washington was humble, resilient, and willing to take advice. These qualities made him exactly the right kind of person to take on the role of president years later. The next morning, I'm brought out to the public square to face execution for plotting to kill Washington. Hickey is the one who was really plotting this, but I need to escape to prove it. At the last minute, I call for Achilles, who sets me free. I rush through the crowd to Hickey right as he charges Washington and his guards. I take down Hickey, and in his last words, he says he just sided with the Templars because they paid him. In real life, Thomas Hickey was jailed for counterfeiting, then tried and executed for mutiny and sedition against the Continental Army. It's not totally proven, but the theory is that Hickey was involved in a plot to assassinate Washington. Hickey became the first American to be executed for sedition, and on June 28, 1776, Washington issued an order stating that he hoped that Hickey's death would serve as an example to all who would think of betraying the cause. Back in the game, we follow Washington back to Philadelphia. There's a slight mistake here. The date should read 1776 instead of 1775, because we are witnessing Benjamin Franklin, John Hancock, and Sam Adams signing the Declaration of Independence. On June 11, 1776, 5 men from the Continental Congress were chosen to form a committee to draft the Declaration. Thomas Jefferson, a delegate from Virginia, took the lead role, drafting the majority of the document himself in the next couple of weeks. The preamble of the Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal, and that we have rights granted by God that cannot be taken away, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The government exists for the purpose of protecting people's rights, and that when a government becomes tyrannical, it's the duty of the people to overthrow that government. These ideas were inspired by philosophers of the Enlightenment, a philosophical and political movement in the 17th and 18th centuries that was a reaction to the rise of authoritarian regimes across Europe in the early modern era. John Locke's 2 treatises on government, published in 1689, argues that people have natural rights like life, liberty, and property, and that government legitimacy comes from the consent of the people. You can clearly see the inspiration for the Declaration of Independence there. French philosopher Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, advocates for the separation of powers within government, which will ultimately shape the structure of the US government years later. Other philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Hobbes, and Voltaire also shaped the founders' beliefs about government, human rights, and the importance of democratic systems for creating a legitimate, balanced system that avoids tyranny. After the philosophical preamble of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson listed a series of grievances that the colonists had with the British government. In the original version of the Declaration, Jefferson wrote, "He has waged a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither." He blames King George for forcing the institution of slavery on the colonies, recognizing slavery as morally evil. This condemnation of slavery was later removed from the Declaration to appease the southern states and keep them on their side. Hypocritically, Jefferson himself owned hundreds of slaves, significantly more than most of the other founding fathers. Jefferson's hypocrisy represents the contradictions between the ideals of the founding fathers and the reality of their society. This tension ultimately led to the Civil War, racial segregation, and the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, and we're still grappling with the legacy of Jefferson's hypocrisy in the 21st century. On July 2, 1776, the Continental Congress officially voted to declare independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, the final draft of the Declaration was approved and published. When the document was read in public, crowds tore down statues of royal authority. In one famous case, a statue of King George III in New York City was melted down and used to make ammunition. The United States was born. Shortly after the publication of the Declaration of Independence, the British launched an offensive in New York and New Jersey. They hoped to take control of the Hudson River, thereby splitting the colonies in two. The Battle of Long Island was the largest land battle of the war, and Washington was defeated, forced to retreat to Manhattan. After further defeats in Manhattan, Washington escaped across the Hudson River to New Jersey, and the British followed. Morale was at an all-time low, troops were deserting, and the hopes for an independent country were looking slim. But in the early morning of December 26, 1776, Washington led a daring attack across the Delaware River into Trenton, New Jersey. Washington ambushed the unsuspecting British forces and Hessian mercenaries, who had been ordered to quarter for the winter. Washington's forces defeated the British at Trenton, then again at Princeton. These were minor victories, but they reinvigorated Americans' morale and saved Washington's reputation for the time being. The following year in 1777, after a few months of stalemate, the British launched an invasion of Philadelphia, where Congress was located. As they approached, Congress evacuated to Lancaster, then York, both in Pennsylvania. In September, the Battle of Brandywine resulted in yet another defeat for Washington, and the British captured Philadelphia. In October, Washington ordered his troops to quarter in nearby Valley Forge for the winter. This would be the hardest winter of the war for the Americans, who were short on supplies, including winter clothing. Nearly 2,000 men would die from disease in that winter alone. Back to the game, Connor arrives in Valley Forge in January 1778 and meets with Washington, who is frustrated at their supply issues. Benjamin Church has been caught sending letters to the British, and Washington suspects that he might be the one behind the supply shortages. We have our next target. I ride to an abandoned church hoping to find Benjamin, but instead run into Haytham Kenway. He wants to punish Church for abandoning the Templars. Since our interests are aligned for now, we agree to work together to find him. We track him down to New York, but it turns out he fled on a ship bound for Martinique, so we board Connor's ship and take to the sea. When we finally board his ship, Haytham beats him up for a bit until Connor stabs and interrogates him. In his dying words, Church mocks Connor for believing that the American cause is truly for the greater good. In real life, Church was initially supportive of the cause for independence, even being involved with the Sons of Liberty. However, Church was caught sending secret messages to British General Thomas Gage in the summer of 1775. Church was exiled from the United States in 1778 in accordance with the Massachusetts Banishment Act, but his ship got lost at sea and he was never heard from again. Another target has been eliminated, but Connor's time with his father has left him reflecting on the true nature of the Founding Fathers.
I hear much talk of freedom and equality, but it seems one must be a landed white man to benefit. What if someone like me, or Surrey? What role for us in this new world? Is my father right then?
In the United States, we like to think of the American Revolution as being a grassroots movement, that ordinary people rose up to throw off the shackles of British tyranny. But the truth is that the men truly responsible for the revolution, people like Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, were the wealthy elite who stood to gain the most from becoming leaders in a new country. The right to vote in the US was originally only granted to those who owned land, and only if you were a white man. Women, people of color, and poor white men were excluded. Connor's support for the revolution is tragically ironic. After a brief meeting with Achilles, Connor heads off to find Haytham again. I find him in New York, and we interrogate some British officers to find out what their next move is going to be. They tell us that the British are planning to march from Philadelphia to New York, so Connor and Haytham head to Valley Forge to warn Washington. When we tell him, Washington agrees to divert American forces to the south to cut off the British advance. The discussion is interrupted when Haytham shows Connor a letter from Washington, ordering the destruction of native villages who ally with the British, including Connor's. In a rage, I race back to the village, executing Patriot messengers along the way to prevent the orders from reaching the attack force. When we get back to the village, Connor learns that his fellow tribesmen are about to attack the American soldiers stationed nearby, so he knocks them out one by one. We run into our old friend, who's been told by Charles Lee that we've been corrupted into working for the ones who really want to steal native land. In self-defense, Connor has to kill his friend, who in his dying words tells Connor that if the Loyalists win, their people will be safe. Throughout the Revolutionary War, Britain sought out alliances with Native Americans to help them fight the Patriots. In exchange for loyalty, the British promised to protect native land from encroachment by settlers. This was a pretty persuasive argument, especially because the British had issued the Royal Proclamation in 1763 that tried to prevent colonists from settling westward. Still, not all tribes and nations sided with the British. The Iroquois Confederacy, for example, was totally shattered by the war. The Oneida and Tuscarora nations sided with the Americans, while the others mostly supported the British. The Cherokee in the South also sided with the British, and they continued fighting the Americans even after the Revolutionary War was ended. In the end, indigenous peoples were left out of the negotiations for the Treaty of Paris that ended the war in 1783. They were forced to sign separate treaties with the American and British governments, which were repeatedly violated in future years. Back to the game, Connor heads south to ensure American victory at the Battle of Monmouth. Here we meet Gilbert de Motier, Marquis de Lafayette, a French military officer who joined the American cause. Now, why are the French getting involved? To explain this, we need to go back for some context. Remember that the French and the British had been enemies for centuries, and that the recent French and Indian War saw the British succeed in kicking France out of North America. The French were eager to get back at the British, but they weren't willing to join a losing war. The Americans had to prove that they could actually beat the British. Many members of the Continental Congress wanted France on their side, especially with their navy to help counter the power of the British fleet. So in December 1776, Benjamin Franklin was sent to France to try to persuade King Louis XVI to join the fight. Lafayette came to America on his own to help the Patriots, serving alongside George Washington in the Battle of Brandywine back in September 1777. In October, the Americans managed to decisively defeat the British at the Second Battle of Saratoga up in New York. This was the largest victory by the Americans to date, resulting in the surrender of British General John Burgoyne. When news of Burgoyne's surrender reached France, they were finally ready to join the Americans. Spain joined the conflict in 1779, and Britain declared war on the Dutch in 1780. The British were suddenly much more isolated, and if the Americans could keep holding out, they might have a chance. Now it's June 28, 1778, and the British Army marching from Philadelphia to New York meets George Washington's forces at the village of Monmouth in New Jersey. When we see a large number of British troops approaching, we're confused. Apparently Charles Lee retreated, allowing the British to advance. Unable to deal with this large force on his own, Lafayette orders a retreat. I stay back to hold off the advancing soldiers, using a cannon to blast the firing lines apart, then rush back to Monmouth to regroup with Lafayette and Washington. Connor tells Washington that Charles Lee has betrayed him, forcing a retreat to make Washington look bad. Lafayette backs up Connor's story, and Washington promises to investigate Lee, but Connor promises to kill Charles Lee if Washington won't do it. In real life, Lee was not actively trying to sabotage Washington and Monmouth, but he was nevertheless vilified by Washington's lieutenants in their reports on the battle. Lee later wrote an angry letter demanding an apology from Washington, and when Washington launched an official inquiry into Lee's actions, Lee demanded a trial by court-martial. At the trial, Lee was found guilty of disobeying orders, misbehaving before the enemy, and disrespecting his commanding officer. Historians debate the truth of those first two charges, but the disrespect was undeniable. If he had simply kept his mouth shut, he wouldn't have drawn attention to himself, but since he went after Washington, his military career was over. While exploring New York City, I find this side quest on the map featuring Major General Benedict Arnold. I find Washington, who's concerned that West Point has been infiltrated and there's a plot to assassinate Arnold, so I head to West Point to check it out. Today we know West Point as an academy for the US military, but the academy wasn't founded until 1802. During the Revolutionary War, it was simply a fort built by American forces outside of New York City. I run around the fort killing spies, then report to Arnold. After doing some menial tasks for him, I notice him sneaking off to talk with John Anderson, also known as Major John Andre. In real life, Andre was a British intelligence officer who infiltrated West Point and coordinated with Benedict Arnold to betray the Americans. The plan was for Arnold to secretly hand over control of West Point to British General Henry Clinton. In the game, we see Arnold hand him a letter addressed to General Clinton, so I follow him through the forest. Unfortunately for him, he gets caught by a couple of American soldiers on patrol, and they discover the letter, exposing Arnold's plot. I return to West Point to confront Arnold, but he escapes. This is pretty close to how it all happened in real life back in 1780. Andre was put on trial and executed by hanging. Benedict Arnold did escape and later commanded British troops in a couple of battles before eventually moving to London in 1791. Historians debate the reasons why Benedict Arnold defected to the British. He was known to hang out with loyalists and British sympathizers, but he was also wounded twice in battle and passed over for promotion multiple times, slowly growing resentful and dissatisfied with the American leadership. Regardless of the true reasons behind his defection, he is one of the most infamous figures in early American history, and it's pretty cool that we get to see him in the game. Back to the main story, years have passed since the Battle of Monmouth. It's 1781, and Connor is at the estate visiting Achilles on his deathbed. Connor updates Achilles on the war. The American forces have the upper hand, and it's only a matter of time before the revolution is over and won. But Achilles warns Connor that as long as Charles Lee and Haytham Kenway live, his mission is not yet complete. I run into Lafayette, who tells me that a French fleet will meet us at Chesapeake Bay. Connor plans to use the French attack at Chesapeake Bay as a distraction for him to infiltrate a fort and kill Charles Lee. In real life, the Battle of the Chesapeake on September 5, 1781, and the subsequent siege of Yorktown, Virginia, were the final battles of the Revolutionary War. British General Charles Cornwallis had brought his men north to Yorktown after a series of campaigns in the south. General Clinton in New York had ordered Cornwallis to set up a fortified position on the coast and wait for evacuation. He sent a fleet commanded by Admiral Thomas Graves from New York to Yorktown to pick him up. As the British fleet approached Yorktown, they were intercepted in Chesapeake Bay by a French fleet under the command of Francois-Joseph Paul de Grasse, who we see in the game. The battle in the game is intense. I destroy many British ships while protecting the French Navy, but in reality no ships were actually sunk during the battle. That evening, Graves assessed his fleet, scuttled one of his ships, and headed back to New York, leaving Cornwallis on his own as the combined American and French forces surrounded him. The siege of Yorktown began on September 28th, lasting around 3 weeks before Cornwallis eventually surrendered on October 19th. In the game, after our success at the Battle of the Chesapeake, the French Navy bombards the British fort as I look for Charles Lee, but I find Haytham Kenway instead. We duel as the fort explodes around us, but in the end, Connor is victorious. As Haytham dies, he tells Connor that he's proud of him for his courage and resilience. Connor walks away from his father's lifeless body. The fight is nearly over. A year later, in 1782, Connor tracks down Charles Lee to Boston Harbor, where it all started nearly 30 years before. During the chase, we both wound each other and Lee escapes, but it's short-lived. Connor tracks Lee to Monmouth and the two share a drink before Connor finishes the job. With his mission complete, Connor takes the old amulet from Lee that Haytham had taken so many years before and buries it near Achilles' grave. After the siege of Yorktown and the surrender of General Cornwallis, the British lost the will to continue the fight. The war had been dragging on for over 5 years at this point, and aside from capturing a few cities, the British had failed to decisively defeat the Americans. The war now spanned from Canada to the Caribbean, and with the French, Spanish, and Dutch tipping the scales in the Americans' favor, it just didn't seem worth it anymore. In 1782, the British began negotiations to end the war, which was finally done with the Treaty of Paris on September 3, 1783. The British would remove their forces from the 13 colonies and recognize the United States as an independent nation. The epilogue of Assassin's Creed 3 takes place in 1783 after the Treaty of Paris was already signed. In New York, we see crowds cheering as the final British boats depart. The cheerful mood of the crowd is juxtaposed with the slave auction taking place just behind Connor. The stage is set for the moral hypocrisy that will define the early decades of American history. Connor returns to his village and finds only a lone hunter sitting at a fire. The hunter tells Connor that his people have left the village, forced to move west after the land was sold by Congress. After all his efforts to support the Patriots with the hope that his village will be protected, Connor was tragically betrayed by the men he put his faith in. In the years after the Revolutionary War, the U.S. was governed by the Articles of Confederation, an agreement between the 13 states to form a loose coalition. The federal government was extremely weak under this agreement. It could make laws but lacked the power to enforce them. The Revolutionary War left the United States in significant debt, a problem which continued to the end of the 18th century. Given that the war began in part due to taxation by the British, Congress was understandably hesitant to raise taxes. In 1787, when the Massachusetts state government tried to raise taxes, a group of armed protesters attempted to seize weapons from an armory in what became known as Shays' Rebellion. The federal government, unable to raise an army to deal with it, had to rely on the Massachusetts state militia to end the rebellion. This led many prominent leaders in the federal government to call for a stronger central government. In the summer of 1787, delegates from each of the states gathered to draft the founding document for the new government, the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution was signed on September 17, 1787, and the first federal elections were held in the winter of 1788 to 89. George Washington was chosen as our first president. For all its failures, the Articles of Confederation did have some success. The Land Ordinance of 1785 and Northwest Ordinance of 1787 laid the groundwork for Western expansion. This led to the Northwest Indian War at the same time as the Cherokee Wars were taking place in the South. Over the next century, the US government would sign, then later violate treaties with Native Americans, ultimately leading to the situation in the modern day when Native American reservations are isolated into some of the most remote, desolate parts of the continent. Connor's story is tragic because he believed in the cause of freedom and justice, but never stopped to consider who this would actually benefit. Of course, there's no guarantee that the British wouldn't have eventually done the same thing. The British had their own history of violating agreements with Native Americans, and with the rapidly growing colonial population in the late 1700s, it was only a matter of time before the British too would go back on their word. The American Revolution foreshadowed the next century of American history in several ways. The betrayal of Native Americans was just the tip of the iceberg. The contradictions between the Founding Fathers' principles and the reality of life for women and racial minorities would set the stage for the women's suffrage movement and of course the conflict over slavery, which would eventually lead to the Civil War in the 1860s. The significance of the American Revolution wasn't in the changes it brought to North America in the 1780s, but rather the ideals it represented. The principles of liberty, justice, and the rule of law, as described in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, would go on to inspire the French Revolution just a few years later. The US government under the Constitution remains one of the world's longest-lasting continuous governments that still exists today. For all the flaws and hypocrisies of the American Revolution, it led to a stable form of government and the gradual expansion of human rights. The process wasn't perfect, and there are still questions of human rights today yet to be resolved. But as Connor said to the dying John Pitcairn, it's better to believe in something ideal than to believe in nothing at all. If you're still watching, thank you from the bottom of my heart. This video was my most ambitious project yet, and I've had a great time making it. I'm excited to bring you more content like this, so if you enjoyed this deep dive into Assassin's Creed 3, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more. A huge thank you to Mr. Terry for his appearance in this video. If you're not subscribed to his channel, go check it out. The link is in the description. Thank you all again so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Peace out for now.